Good evening. My name is Chase Robinson, and I'm the president of the Graduate Center, and I have the great privilege of welcoming you to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. What is the world's greatest threat? That's the question that the Pew Foundation put to 48,000 respondents in 44 countries in the spring and early summer of 2014. In the Middle East, the answer most frequently given was religious and ethnic hatred. In Asia, it was pollution and the degraded environment. In Africa, it was AIDS and other epidemics. In Europe and in the United States, ahead of terrorism, ahead of disease and climate change, indeed ahead of all other threats, the answer was inequality. Little wonder, as research conducted by our own Janet Gornick and her colleagues has demonstrated, income inequality in the US has increased by nearly 20% in the last 3 decades. Today, it is greater here than in most other high-income countries. That high level of income inequality goes hand in hand with high poverty rates. The US national poverty rate exceeds that reported in at least 20 other rich countries. Now, CUNY, which enrolls about 270,000 degree-seeking students, is an extraordinary project in reducing inequality and increasing opportunity. Almost 40% of CUNY undergraduates come from households with annual incomes below $20,000 a year. 42% of CUNY undergraduates are the first in their families to go to college. The Graduate Center, where you're sitting here tonight, focuses on doctoral degrees and advanced teaching and research, and it is a crucial part of that CUNY project. Every year, our doctoral students reach about 200,000 undergraduates in CUNY's classrooms and labs. And this institution, I'm very proud to say, is becoming the single most important locus for the study of inequality. We can boast leading researchers and experts, the world's most important income database and resource, the Luxembourg Income Study Center, and of course, collaboration with CUNY colleagues. Among them is Michael Jacobson, who, as director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, launched its Equality Indicators Index, which measures New York's progress towards greater equality over time. For these and for many other reasons, we could not be more delighted to host tonight's conversation, which features 3 of the nation's most prominent thinkers on the topic of inequality. First, Mayor Bill de Blasio, the 109th mayor of New York City, a position he's held for just over 2 years. In his first year, he introduced free pre-kindergarten education for every child in the city, effectively adding which effectively added another year of schooling for some 65,000 students, including half of New Yorkers' homeless children. As the New York Times editorial board put it, no other city has done something so big, so quickly, and it would not have happened but for Bill de Blasio. In his own words, inequality is something that I'm going to speak about every chance I get and everywhere I go, because this is a crisis facing our nation and our city. Well, Mr. Mayor, there is no better time than tonight, or no better place than where we are now. Thank you for coming. The mayor is joined on the stage by 2 faculty members from the Graduate Center. Paul Krugman is a Nobel laureate, New York Times columnist. He's an author. He's distinguished scholar here at the List Center, and he's distinguished professor in the PhD program in economics. He's been called the most important political economist in America. Perhaps more tellingly, he's also been called the Mick Jagger of political economic punditry.
That's pretty cool.
He is the author of numerous best-selling books, including I Can't Go No Satisfaction. Actually, that's not a book of his. End This Depression Now, his most recent book. Janet Gornick is Professor of Political Science and Sociology and Director of the List Center here at the Graduate Center. For over 30 years, Janet has been a leading researcher and educator in the field of American social welfare policy, especially as it affects families. Her most recent book, co-edited with Marcus Yunti, is Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. Now, I will note in closing the following. Paul and Janet share more than a commitment to the study of inequality or adjacent offices here at the Graduate Center. CUNY's mission is to educate the children of the whole people. Both Paul and Janet are children of CUNY. Paul's dad, David, attended Brooklyn College, and Janet's father, Fred, was an alumnus of City College. Fred, who used to sit in the front row, beaming very proudly as his daughter performed on this stage, passed away on October 22nd. I take the liberty of dedicating the night's event to the memory of Fred Gornick. Now, on to inequality. Please do join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Chase. Mayor de Blasio, let me echo Chase in saying, of course, how thrilled and delighted and honored we are to have you with us tonight. And we're especially pleased to have the opportunity and to give you the opportunity to talk about inequality, this subject that has been so crucial, of course, to your work throughout many years on the City Council as public advocate and as mayor. And we're just delighted to have you, to give you the time, I hope, to talk in a little bit more detail than you're usually able to do. We hope so. Professor Krugman, Paul, to many of us, welcome. Welcome back to the stage yet again for another event in our series of public programs focusing on the causes and the nature and the consequences of inequality. We're very pleased to give you the opportunity to talk to the mayor this evening, and we're counting on you, as we always do, to help us understand the complicated economics that the economic forces that are driving inequality forward. Let me do a little bit of logistics before I ask some questions. So first of all, this is what to expect. For about 45 minutes, I'm going to pose some questions to our guests, about 7 questions. I'm going to start with 2 rather general questions, and then I'm going to try to get to 5 policy areas that have been very central to the mayor's administration: universal pre-K, affordable housing, economic security for low-wage workers, working conditions, and of course, public support for urban higher education, especially CUNY, a subject very important to many of us in the room here. So my hope is to give them time for some exchange, but I've also been invited by the mayor to nudge them along if he gets too enthusiastic and talks at too much length, so we'll see if I can do that with some modicum of grace. So the other thing to mention, we are being live streamed, and we're also being broadcast live on CUNY TV as well as on WNYE, so thank you for that. And for those of you in the live stream audience, in the modern world, we have to give you a hashtag, and our hashtag for the evening is GCINQ, GC Inc. And finally, just to tell you, many of you came in, and I hope when you came in, you were handed index cards. You'll have the opportunity to write some questions, and some ushers will pick those questions up from you at 7:10, and then some will sort them and they'll be handed to me. And I'm looking forward to getting some of your questions and posing them to our guests, and I'm under strict instructions to finish at 7:45, so hopefully we can do all of that. Mayor de Blasio, let me ask you to start with a rather general question. As I'm sure you know, many people inside New York and all over the country were very captivated when you focused your campaign in 2013 on inequality, and of course it's been sort of the beating heart of the first 2 years of your administration. So I'd like you to tell us why, and let me flesh that question out just a little bit. Why did you decide to make combating inequality so central when, as mayor, you have access to a limited set of policy levers? Why pursue inequality reduction in a city so famous for, and some would say dependent on, its financial sector, where they tend to enjoy their compensation on the high end? And why focus on reducing inequality at a time when the country was just beginning to climb out of the Great Recession?
Well, it was for me very personal, beginning with stories I heard from members of my family and my wife Shirlane's family, because it became clear to me that we didn't climb out of the recession, that people had their lives disrupted, and the rules of the game as we had known them before weren't operating anymore. You know, I grew up in a family where a lot of the older relatives talked about the effect of the Great Depression. And, you know, we heard this at every family dinner, like a mantra, and people lost their businesses, people lost their jobs, people were set back for years and years. I didn't expect to hear anything like that again in my life. But what I found was people in my own family who had suddenly found or experienced a kind of economic insecurity they thought was unimaginable. People in my own family had to wonder whether the next generation would do as well as they had done. And even for Shirlane and I, we have great confidence in Dante and Chiara and their possibilities, but we see, you know, some limits on them that we didn't have. And both our children were early on just independently obsessed with concern about college debt in a way that we weren't. So I saw a whole series of things happening very personally, but then I started to more and more hear it from just everyday New Yorkers, especially when I started running for mayor. You know, I kicked off my campaign in many ways substantively in October 2012, calling for a tax on people who made $500,000 or more to pay for the pre-K program. And that really was the beginning definitional moment of saying this campaign would be about fighting inequality and calling out some very hard truths that we were experiencing and the tale of two cities that we are still living in so many ways. After that, I found people, they didn't just tell me their stories, they like grabbed me by the arm to tell me they had lost their job, to tell me they could not afford their housing any longer, to tell me that they were desperately scared, or even if they had a little bit of savings, they didn't know if it would sustain them. So it became clear to me that something very different was going on in our city and our country. And it has to be talked about here. This is a place, you're right, there are some real disparities here, and there are realities here as the center of so much of the national and global business community, and certainly the finance community. This is the place where this debate has to happen. We have to make change starting here. Now, I contest respectfully that the limits on our tools, not to say that we can do what a state or a federal government can do, but to say that we have powerful tools. In fact, every government has powerful tools. Because if you can, depending on where you are, if you can give 500,000 more people paid sick leave like we did in this city, or in some places you can raise the minimum wage, and we're fighting to do that at the state level. Some cities have the power to do that themselves. Or if you can give 68,000 families free pre-K, which takes an expense of $10,000 or $15,000 a year off of them, or give middle school kids free after-school programs. I mean, all of these are ways of addressing inequality and lightening the burden. Obviously, no expense more important to New Yorkers than affordable housing. We have the biggest affordable housing plan in the history of any city in this country. These are the things we can do, but it does not, for a moment, replace what the federal government could and should do. And so I'll close this answer with this. I've been working with progressives around the country, and more we are forming common cause on issues of economic inequality. We started a coalition called the Progressive Agenda, and you can look it up at progressiveagenda.us. And the notion is to gather together elected officials, labor leaders, faith leaders, even some business leaders who understand that what's happening now in inequality is destabilizing this nation, to fight for the changes we need on the federal level. Higher taxes on the wealthy, more benefits for working people, paid sick leave, paid family leave, pre-K, higher wages, higher minimum wage. This basic prescription is what will reverse this rampant inequality, and it must be achieved at the national level. And I think the debate that's happening this year and last year, 2015-16, is a moment of profound change, and I would wager this to the whole audience this evening. I believe we're at the beginning of a sustained new progressive era in this country. I can see things happening in this debate right now nationally that were unimaginable just a few years ago. This issue, this impulse for change, is not cresting now, it is just beginning now. It is just beginning. And so we in New York City will show what one city can do to fight inequality. We hope it will also add to what is now a growing national movement to do this in every city and every state, and indeed to have our federal government join the fight against inequality.
I had some things I was going to say, but I think I'm going to let that go. I mean, that's just so perfect. So let's see. I think we can come back to some of the other things.
You are cheating the audience.
We'll come back. I actually am going to I think, have a chance to weigh in, but I think in a slightly different context. So.
And actually, Paul, I'm going to ask you a question directed to you, which is related. As we have sat on this stage many times in the last year or two, we've often reflected, as the mayor just mentioned, on this extraordinary increase in attention that's being paid now to income inequality. Various of our partners and colleagues have attributed it to the Occupy movement, of course, to the global financial crisis and the Great Recession and so forth. So, and you've been, of course, watching this. Obviously, the mayor has shined a spotlight on this to a great degree. So, Paul, talk to us a little bit about why do you think this has happened now? Why not 30 years ago when the increase in inequality began? Why has it sustained itself? We were all saying 5 years ago this is never going to last. And I think my final question for you is, are your fellow and sister economists paying attention?
Okay, so first, I have to say sometimes these days I find myself feeling rather old because the truth is it's a little bit more complicated. It was not that inequality was ignored. It has had ebbs and flows. It was a surprisingly, I think for younger people probably don't remember, I'm not even sure older people remember, but it was a surprisingly big issue in the early 1990s. It was a pretty big theme in the 1992 presidential election. You may remember Bill Clinton saying, 70% of the gains have gone to 1%, which happens to have been my number. But anyway, if you look at Clinton's original, his first year agenda, which was higher taxes at the top and universal health care, that was actually a program of making at least a moderate-sized assault on inequality. So the issue was there. It faded away partly because the health reform crashed and burned, but also because the 90s was a good decade, because during an economic boom that, although it was very disproportionately still going to the top, it in fact did produce a substantial rise in living standards, a substantial rise in median income and wages, so that people, it kind of faded out. It was also, may I say, a boom that was driven by technology. Felt almost like capitalism was working the way it was supposed to. It wasn't actually, but it looked like it was. Then after 2000, we were a little bit distracted by terrorism and wars and so on. And so it really took the revelation of the rottenness of the system in 2008 to bring this thing to the fore, which is actually part of why I want to answer one of the question that you posed that the mayor didn't quite answer, which was why focus on these things when we have also the task of an economic recovery that's still incomplete. And the answer is, if not now, when? You have to grab these things while they're salient. The fact of the matter is inequality has been an issue that we should have been addressing all along, but we have got the public's attention. I don't think it's ready to go away, but I think now is the time to elevate it, and perhaps also, we are learning. I think progressives are learning something about achieving stuff. I think that you look at the minimum wage movement, and we see that people have realized that, look, you don't have to, raising the minimum wage isn't going to solve the problem of inequality, isn't going to solve the problem of poverty, but it'll make a big difference. And finding that they can do these things, so and also acting locally. Think globally, act locally. Well, actually, there are lots of things that you can't be done at the level of a city, but quite a few things that can, and they can provide a model, a template for the rest. So now is the time. I don't think this is going away. I think people have, in fact, finally gotten sensitized. It took amazingly long. If you'd asked me in 1992 whether we would be sitting around 24 years later and saying, gee, finally it's an issue, I would have probably given up in despair. But, all good things come to those who wait.
Quick follow-on, if I may, to the $15 minimum wage. 2 points. One, the Fight for 15 movement. And I think you're absolutely right to identify Occupy as a crucial piece of this historical trajectory. But the Fight for 15 movement, I think we're going to look back and realize it was catalytic and a movement. I remember literally less than 2 years ago, this being just dismissed out of hand in many, many places here and around the country. This now has become, the lingua franca. This is now the main street of the discussion in this country, that $15 minimum wage is the reference point. That's a powerful achievement for a social movement, and it says a lot about the moment we're in and how much more there is that can be reached. Secondly, that in our vision for the city, we've put forward a long-range vision. We call it One NYC. And it is literally how we want to see this city develop in every sense, in terms of environment and economy and resiliency, but also in terms of equality and fairness over the next 20, 30 years. Our vision is over the next 10 years, we can get 800,000 New Yorkers out of poverty if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and we continue to build all the other supports, the affordable housing, the pre-K, the paid sick leave, all the pieces that uplift people. Think about that for a moment. That is basically a tenth of the population of this city. That is reachable and attainable if we get to a $15 minimum wage, because we're already committed to the other pieces. So I think Paul's exactly right that minimum wage is, achieving a higher minimum wage is not the same thing as ending inequality, but achieving a higher minimum wage is the gateway to fundamentally changing a lot of other things in our society.
Paul, are economists listening?
Yeah, well, in fact, economists to an interesting degree have actually driven this. I mean, this is one of those cases where there's almost a perfect marriage of really good economic research and really good social policy. I mean, if you had asked most people, even me, 20 years ago, what do you think are the effects of raising the minimum wage? I would have said, well, I'm for it, but I'm really worried about the side effects. But then we found out from Alan Kruger, David Carr, terrific, and then a huge batch of research that at least at U.S. levels of the minimum wage, there is no hint of those adverse effects, and it really is a win-win type of policy. So it all comes together, and economists, I think, economists were slow. Although some people have focused on some of these issues, economists were slow to get moving on the issue of inequality, partly for bad reasons. It wasn't popular. You're not going to get large amounts of funding from the Heritage Foundation to study inequality, but also because it happens to be an intellectually difficult subject. Trying to understand, I mean, to this day, we really don't fully understand why inequality skyrocketed the way it is. So it's a hard subject, and simply being important is not always enough to get people working on it. But I think people have finally, my profession has realized that this is important enough, and we have enough good work. So I think there's a kind of a multiplier. Boy, I'm sounding like an economist. There's a multiplier effect. As people work on it, it becomes a better field. As action, often local action, makes significant progress on pieces of the inequality problem, it becomes a more popular political movement, because this is someplace where you can get things done. And so we are building. I think it's a wave that comes not just from public outrage, though that's part of it, but also from political and economic success, and at least making some difference in the right direction.
One other quick point, I think it's become cultural. I'm saying this, I'm not an academic, I'm saying this as a layman. It's become cultural in the sense that the conversation has now turned from not just a description of what each individual circumstance is and their concerns and their complaints, but now people are literally talking about inequality. They're talking about income inequality. They're naming it, as was indicated earlier, in polls as their central concern. There was a very uncomfortable moment in one of the recent Republican debates when the moderator said, how do you respond to this polling information that says 68% of the American people want higher taxes on those who earn $1 million or more? 68%, that's not just Democrats and liberals. And we see very interestingly that this is cutting across traditional ideological and regional and partisan boundaries. So I think it's become an American values question, that this kind of inequality doesn't comport with what we understood our country to be. It doesn't with how it was founded, what we've been told all our lives are the values and our opportunities to have real access to meaningful opportunity. This is now grating against people's sense of who they are and who the country is. And that's why I predict much bigger changes, because I think it has now become very personal and very cultural.
Wonderful. I might add, we also have much more data and better data than we had 30 years ago.
Of course, better data.
Self-serving comment, but it's true. Mayor de Blasio, I'm going to turn your attention to a policy issue that is extremely near to your heart, I know you've already mentioned. When you ran your campaign for mayor, a lot of us amazed already, were even more amazed, when you put universal pre-K so much at the center. Something I've studied for many years, universal pre-K, pre-kindergarten, I think everyone knows. In your first, then after being elected in your first state of the city, you said we were going to offer every child from every borough in the city truly universal full-day pre-K. Why did you decide to make pre-K so central to your campaign and administration? I think it was an unusual move. It was a hidden issue, if I may say so. Talk to us about how you understand pre-K. How does it combat inequality? Inequality of what sort, among whom? And tell us now, 2 years later, how satisfied are you? What have been the constraints? What lies ahead?
So again, as I came from a family that was richly involved in the experience of the 60s and the 70s, so I'll borrow a phrase, the personal is political, and say that for Charlene and I, we experienced as people who had some advantages, the struggle of finding quality childcare and trying to figure out, when our kids were younger, how do you balance that would work and how do you afford it? And that opened my eyes very personally to the fact that for folks who didn't have a lot of resources, this was a really, really tough dynamic. And what often happened was the thing that got sacrificed was early childhood education because families couldn't navigate it, they couldn't find it, they couldn't afford it. And many families didn't even realize, no fault of their own, what an extraordinary multiplier effect it would have for their child and their future. So the more I looked at it, the more and I did look at a lot of the research, but I also just talked to everyday people about what it meant to them, and it became clear to me that of all the things that could be done and done fast and done truly universally, this is one of the things that would have the greatest impact. In the immediate foreground, it fights inequality because, again, for a single child in this city, it will cost you $10,000 to $15,000 to get full-day pre-K. If you couldn't get it in a public program that existed previously, it would cost you that kind of money. For working people and middle-class people, that is an unbelievably big bite out of their budget. Multiple children in a family over years, you can imagine how that adds up. So there's an immediate tangible impact, and of course, freeing up time for people to work who previously were constrained because they didn't have good options for their children. When we came into office, 20,000 kids had full-day pre-K. Today, 68,500, almost 50,000 more. And we said, and part of what, we found plenty of constraints, we found plenty of problems because the system wasn't geared to doing something on such a mass level. It literally was adding a whole nother grade to our school system, but there was no constraint that couldn't be overcome if we said this was our number one priority. A simple, easy leadership lesson. If you say something's your number one priority enough times, everyone around you starts to believe it. And they do things they wouldn't normally do. And so we just stayed very on message and moved the bureaucracy. But the other thing I'd say is the longer term impact on fighting inequality. So this is sort of a key twofer. In the here and now, a family gets some major budgetary relief and a parent can work who might not have been able to work before. But going forward, that child who is 4 years old today, when they graduate high school in 14 years or college in 18 years, they are going to be, I believe it in many, many cases, because they got that early child education foundation, they're going to be in a much stronger situation. They're going to be much better educated. I also think a lot of kids are going to graduate high school or get to college because they got that foundation. A lot of kids are going to not be, unfortunately, diverted into negative life choices or negative outcomes because they got that foundation. And what you see, if you go to a pre-K classroom, not only is it the great equalizer, because this is a truly universal program, every kind of child together, you can tell early on, I don't need the research to know this part, you can tell it is hope-inducing for both child and parent alike. These kids get engaged very early, and they learn how to learn, and they learn how to love learning. And then that has an amazing multiplier effect going forward.
And I think there's something important about values. Everyone in America says that they favor equality of opportunity. Yes. Now, many of them don't actually mean it, but as the line goes, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue, right? That no one in American politics dares say that he's against equality of opportunity. And here's something which is so very clearly about equality of opportunity. It's something you can do. And it works. I mean, we can even there is. I don't think we know. Obviously we don't know yet how your program is going to work, though I'm quite sure that you're right. But there's lots of evidence that early things, nutrition, healthcare for children, even in the narrowest sort of, I don't care about people, just fiscal sense, well overpays for itself. That it makes more productive citizens who pay more taxes later in life. So this has got, and this is one of the things where, yeah, you can really. I think it's important to have success stories, and it is something where we can say, look, this is the story we tell ourselves about America. It is the place where anyone can make their way. And if we say, well, look, here's something we can do that makes that closer to actually being true, it's something you can make actually happen.
Two very quick follow-ons. One, yes, we've been evaluating it, as you asked that question too, and we're very pleased with what we're seeing, the real immediate impact it's making. And we're hearing from a lot of teachers at the kindergarten level what that first year of pre-K meant in terms of a whole class of children ready to learn at the next level. So we're seeing great results in terms of qualitative consistency across our programs. There's always more to do, but very satisfied qualitatively. Quantitatively, there's still more kids who could take advantage of it, and we still have work to do at the community level convincing parents that this opportunity is extraordinarily important for their kids. So please, anyone out there who knows a parent with a 4-year-old starting this September, make sure they know about free pre-K. But the other thing I want to say is this is an interesting issue because it has tremendous bipartisan potential. After New York City, we're very proud of what we've done. A few other cities have done amazing things. But the next place you think about is the state of Oklahoma, which has been a leader on pre-K, which happens to be a very red state. Equal fervor there. This may be one of those issues in terms of fighting inequality where we could start to find some bipartisan consensus.
That's right. Oklahoma and Georgia are two of the country's leaders. Let me turn to another topic, perhaps number 2, in terms of what you've really emphasized. I'm going to actually direct this poll to you first. So, as we all know, Mayor de Blasio's administration has talked a lot about affordable housing, something that you've written about and thought about quite a bit. Let me step back first and ask you to say a little bit about the underlying problem. What is driving up housing prices in New York? And let me add that in a column that you wrote, which I think attracted a bit of attention, you were writing about differences in economic and population growth, economic development and population growth across regions. And you wrote limits on building height in the cities, zoning that blocks denser development in the suburbs, and other policies constrict housing on both coasts. Meanwhile, looser regulation in the South has kept the supply of housing elastic and the cost of living low. So conservatives' complaints about excess regulation and intrusive government are not entirely wrong. Could you say more about that? Somewhat surprising from you. Say more about that and clarify what you see as the policy implications for the mayor's administration.
Okay, so just to say right away, no, we don't want New York to turn into Houston or Dallas, right? That's not the goal. No, but there is something. If we step back at the national level for a moment, and what you see is that there's a peculiar and I think fundamentally dysfunctional dynamic, which is population in the United States does not flow from highly productive, not from low productivity parts of the country to high productivity. It's actually the reverse. We have places like New York where worker productivity is very high, where people really make a huge contribution to the economy. But on balance, people flow out of those regions into places like the South and the big sprawling metro areas where housing is cheap. And now, to some extent, okay, New York is an enormous city, an enormous metropolitan area. It's never going to be as cheap a place to live as a much smaller city, but it doesn't have to be as expensive as it is. It is possible to build higher. This is a little thing I've been tracking. If we look at not overall population density, obviously the number of people in metropolitan New York has gone up over the years, but if we ask how dense is the district in which the average person lives, it's actually been declining. Not dramatically, but a little bit. We actually have been seeing declining population-weighted density, which is saying, look, it's just one indicator that we could be building more. We could be building more housing. Now, New York, actually, let me say 2 more. One, an economistic thing, and then I can segue it, I think. There is when people, for whatever reason, for their neighborhood, when they oppose increased development, more housing, there are reasons for that, but they are also, in fact, imposing what we would call an externality. They're imposing a cost, in some ways, on the rest of the population of New York. They're making housing more expensive because it's limiting the supply, and housing happens to be one of those things. If you make housing more expensive, that actually does increase effective inequality, because the people with lower income spend a higher share of their income on housing. So it is somewhat exacerbating the inequality problem. NIMBYism, if you like, has some adverse effect. Now, there are also other kinds of externalities: congestion, noise, crowding out the light, which a city like New York has to take into account. But I think there's lots of reasons to think that we could change that balance. And in particular, because New York is such a high productivity, such a desirable place, it can make deals. It can basically say, look, we will let you do a little bit more, we'll let you go higher, we'll let you go denser, but you have to provide affordable housing, which is what you're trying to do, of course. This is something, it's not going to be a completely zoning free, it shouldn't be, like some cities out there, but it can be more. We can have more people, we can have density that will make the city a better place and also make it a place that's more affordable for ordinary people. Which is the program. I mean,
It is the program. We agree, as is so often true. So right now we're debating something in this city. It's a proposal I strongly believe in called mandatory inclusionary zoning. And despite that sexy title, it is a very important thing. Keyword mandatory. Our view is that since the public sector controls the spigot of development in many ways, not entirely, because there certainly are areas of this city where there's a right for a certain amount of development to occur that we don't get to intervene on. But when there are so many opportunities in the public sector to determine the shape of development on behalf of the people, there should be an ironclad requirement on the real estate industry to create affordable housing. Literally, if we don't get affordable housing, you don't get to develop. It's as simple as that. And so this concept of mandatory inclusionary zoning puts a clear set of rules in place that simply require affordable housing as part of anything that's created within certain contexts. So why I think this is so important is it picks up on what Paul is saying. I felt this contradiction as someone who represented communities in Brooklyn in the city council, and they happened to be, many of the communities were places that people were doing reasonably well. They weren't the biggest or sort of tallest, densest areas. And people, I think, with a full heart, professed progressive beliefs in an economically diverse city and in addressing the inequalities among us. And then when I said, great, we need to build affordable housing and that's going to take heightened density, shockingly, some people were like, well, wait a minute, I want to help people in need, but I don't want heightened density. And to be real with people, we're going to need a certain amount of heightened density to actually achieve the kind of affordable housing we need. My plan is for 200,000 units of affordable housing, 200,000 apartments. It's enough for 500,000 people. My affordable housing plan would provide affordable housing to as many people as live in all of Kansas City. And it's not enough. And I say it very openly. That's what we think we can reach over the next 10 years. But there's lots more need beyond that. But we have to have heightened density in the right places, not everywhere, not without rules, but in the right places to be able to achieve that. And the last thing that I would be comfortable with is freezing in place inequality. And I understand why it's such a painful and complicated discussion because, bluntly, this city has never come to grips with gentrification. We've never looked it in the eye and had a serious, sustained policy discussion about how we're going to confront gentrification. I'm trying to do that through my affordable housing plan and a lot of other approaches. But in fact, if we look at a stratified city and we look at a tale of two cities, it's our obligation to shake the foundations of that. That's why I believe in things like mandatory inclusionary zoning and a very aggressive role of government in creating affordable housing.
let me just add that wearing my economist hat, if I were going to ask where are the restrictions on development doing the most to reinforce or lock in inequality, it actually, although there is stuff, quite a lot that can be done in the city, it is, of course, the suburbs are where we really have, as a resident of Princeton, which I am no longer, but when I was, it was I had mixed feelings, of course, of, would I really want an apartment block down my street? But in fact, the zoning is ridiculously exclusionary in a lot of the suburban areas.
Yeah.
Before I ask the next question, just remind everybody, I think it's time to pass your questions down to the aisles. I've been instructed to remind you at 7:10, which is where we are now. Let me turn to another question then. We've already spoken about this, but I think it's worth another reflection. I'm going to also address this to you, Paul, as it's sort of a fundamental economics question. The discussion of the $15 an hour minimum wage. So this week, a group of New York economists and social scientists have circulated a letter in support of increasing New York State's minimum wage. I think many of you know the proposal on the table, $15 an hour in New York City by 2018 and statewide by 2021. And that letter, Paul, quotes you actually in a remark that you made, in fact, on this stage. Yeah. You were reflecting on recent empirical work as you just started again and noted there's absolutely no reason to think a $15 minimum wage would be a problem for New York. That may seem obvious to people in the room here, but it isn't, of course, to everybody. So say a little bit more about that. How would raising the minimum wage affect inequality? And also say a little bit about, obviously, the question we would hear all the time. Can the market tolerate $15 an hour? What do you say to critics who tell you that employers will lay off, cut hours, or raise prices?
Okay, so this is this is one of the, I'd say it's one of the most studied and one of the best studied issues in economics, because it turns out we have lots of natural experiments. This is what began with Krugman when New Jersey raised its minimum wage and Pennsylvania did not, and not in the same year anyway. And so you could just look what happened to employment in adjacent areas. And the answer was, to their surprise, nothing. And we now have many, many examples because we have a federal system, because we have minimum wages set at the state and sometimes the city level. We have many cases where minimum wages are changed, and no one has ever been able to find any real evidence. And we think we know why. We think that labor markets are not like the market for wheat. They're supply and demand, sort of, but actually we are dealing with people here. And we're dealing with situations where employers care about having a sufficient incentive for workers, where there's a lot more wiggle room in markets than we think. And so it turns out that with the U.S. minimum wages are very low relative to average earnings, relative to our own historic standards, relative to other advanced countries. And in that range, it seems to be, I would say the evidence is overwhelming that there is no significant employment effect of raising the minimum wage that you should worry about. And of course, it means more income for people who need it. So it's an all good thing. Now, if you would ask, well, I mean, I don't think even the most progressive economists in there would be in favor of a $40 minimum wage, right? We know that there have to be some limits. What you can say about New York is that this is a high productivity, high income economy. If we look at any kind of historical norms for minimum wages, $15 in New York is not a high minimum wage. It's not pushing remotely into the region where you would start to say, oh, now we've finally reached the point where bad things start to happen. So perfectly, I mean, $15 in New York, if you compare it with the minimum wages that prevailed in most of America for a generation after World War II, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for productivity, is not high. So no problem at all. It should be a no-brainer. Of course, politics being what it is, it's not, but it shouldn't be a problem at all.
Mayor?
Well, I'll just say one, Paul said it all. I would say a simple follow-on about the concept minimum wage. I believe when I was coming up that we thought of that as maybe not a perfect living wage, but a wage where you could viably feed a family and pay the rent. That's just not even close at this point. The minimum wage we've had in this state, and the state governs the city's minimum wage as well, the minimum wage we've had for years has been out of step with the reality of the cost of housing and the cost of living here. So I think one of the powerful things about the Fight for 50 in this whole discussion is it's getting us back to the concept of minimum wage is supposed to be the thing below which we do not think working people should have to live, that we should not subject people to a wage that they cannot actually live on, at least essentially. And in that way, this is a very healthy debate because it's redefining our notion of fairness. I've heard all these arguments 1,000 times about the negative effects. Paul's made the point that they were not proven. But to me, the kicker has always been, so okay, what's the alternative? Have people make less money than they can afford to live on, and we're going to make it up with welfare programs? That's not productive, that's not effective, that's not fair. But it's kind of been a lie to suggest that we should somehow exist with a minimum wage that people can't live on. I think that was a broken concept that actually we all allowed to happen for too long.
And you sound fairly optimistic about the politics on the 15.
Well, I would say two things. On the broad-scale national debate, and again, I believe what you're seeing raging right now, particularly in the Democratic contest with both candidates talking about raising the minimum wage, both candidates talking about taxing the wealthy more, et cetera, but even a bit on the Republican side, at least the questions being asked, and from time to time, some of these issues being discussed. And certainly the anger you see in the electorate rightfully. This is all going to keep pushing the $15 minimum wage issue. And I think you're going to see good dominoes falling, more and more states and localities acting. And I think at a certain point it's going to make federal action inevitable based on what I'm seeing now. In the state of New York, this is going to be a real fight. And anyone who cares about this issue should not take it lightly over the next few months, because there's still a Republican state Senate that is rabidly opposed to going all the way to $15, and we're going to have to fight hard to get there. And this state, it should be a no-brainer, but in fact, it's going to be a real fight.
Right. So, Mayor de Blasio, talk a little bit about something that goes, of course, hand in glove with the minimum wage, and that's putting a floor under benefits and working conditions for workers, an area that I think you've also spoken about very, very much. Of course, we know that, if I'm correct, your first piece of legislation that you signed in New York City was the paid sick leave law that is that brought a very hard-fought and famous battle to resolution. Not 1 minute too soon, I might add. Last month, I know you signed an executive order, a personnel order, giving paid parental leave to 20,000 non-unionized municipal employees. So talk to us about working conditions and benefits. Again, it's not obvious to everybody why that is an important element in inequality. What comes next? Paid family leave? That's usually done at the state level, we know. What comes next? How far can the city go on protecting and improving working conditions and benefits for New York City workers?
Two things we're doing right now. So the paid parental leave was for the 20,000 city workers that we could grant it to immediately, 6 weeks, fully paid parental leave. And that's for the birth of a child, adoption of a child, or when someone becomes a foster parent. And that's, of course, for any parent. And the goal is to then expand that to our entire workforce of 350,000 people. That's going to take collective bargaining agreements in each case. But we've got a lot of enthusiasm from our labor unions to get this done, so I'm very, very hopeful that this will ultimately reach hundreds of thousands of people. We also announced a new initiative to create a retirement security plan that would be available to workers in the private sector in New York City businesses that they could buy into, because bluntly, there's a huge number of people in the city who have no meaningful retirement security plan whatsoever, and the private sector is no longer consistently providing that, nor are there sufficient federal and state options right now, so the city came forward with our own proposal that we hope will add that benefit for a lot of people. So from my point of view, it's continuing to build out the whole package, and to round it off to your point, look, what's the society we're trying to build? A higher wage level, paid sick leave, paid family leave, the actual retirement security, all of these pieces combined with affordable housing programs, combined with pieces like free pre-K and after school, which take, again, big pieces out of a family's budget, combined with a higher wage. And we're very proud of the fact we've increased to $15 the minimum wage for 50,000 city workers and nonprofit workers who weren't yet at that level. All of these pieces make, I think, each and every one makes a very major impact on a family's life. If you combine them, it's a huge impact. And that's why I'm so hopeful, and that's why we have a vision to get 800,000 New Yorkers out of poverty. But this is a city that has arguably the strongest local government anywhere in the country, the most social democratic local government anywhere in the country in terms of, we're New Yorkers, and we've always assumed a big, muscular government. I have an $82 billion budget and 350,000 employees. That's what we think is the normal scale here. Most places locally don't have as much opportunity proportionally. That's why this extraordinarily powerful movement has to migrate from locality to state and ultimately to the federal level, because we can't put that package of change together that would actually start to break the back of inequality. We can't do that until we get to the federal level for most Americans.
And so I'm going to make the political point, which is it turns out that while people get, there's a prejudice, a carefully instilled prejudice against government doing stuff. Everybody, even self-identified Republicans, tends to favor things that let people get bigger rewards. And so things like higher minimum wage, more family benefits, those are things that tend to command remarkably broad support. It's really only the professional politicians on the right who are against it. Their own voters are actually for it, which again means that this is a very good place to work.
Right. Amen.
Maybe there will be a day we're not the only country in the world without paid maternity leave at the national level, but we'll come back to that perhaps.
Right. So, Amen.
Definitely.
Amen.
Yeah. I know I'm supposed to be asking the questions.
And just 10 more seconds, it's a related point. I think what's also happening is, so how are we going to get all this? We're going to have to tax the wealthy. We're going to have a truly progressive tax system. And two examples to me are powerful, and I'm going to be working on both of these. Closing the carried interest loophole and the Buffett rule. Simply put, famously Warren Buffett saying he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. These are two ideas that when you talk to everyday people across the ideological spectrum, and I've talked to people in different parts of the country, these are really readily acceptable to people, very diverse constituencies can buy into, that hedge funders should not have a separate set of tax rules that benefit them and that they pay a lower tax rate than everyone else. That's a really straightforward notion. And the notion that working people should not pay a higher tax rate than the wealthy. Those two alone would provide tens of billions of dollars to actually start to fund some of these changes we need. And again, those could become crossover issues if this current political dynamic continues to grow, which, just on an action point, is why we should all be pushing this current political dynamic, because there's lots of potential action that could come from it.
No, it's just, we actually had a little experiment, at the national level in 2013. It's amazing how few people really realize this, but tax rates at the top went up significantly. The average tax rate paid by the 1% is up 3 or 4% of income. And we also had a major expansion of benefits to the general public in 2014, all of which was supposed to produce, catastrophe, a job killer. And in fact, we've had the best job growth since the 1990s, all through that period. So we've just seen, now, all of these things, nothing goes on forever. We don't want, even I don't want 91% top tax rates the way we had back when that socialist Dwight Eisenhower was president. But we clearly have a lot more running room on this, and this is where to go. And there's none of this will change us. Even everything on your wish list, even everything on my wish list, not only wouldn't end inequality, probably wouldn't even push inequality back to where it was in 1970, but it would help. And it would make, and the changes in ordinary people's lives can be immense.
Amen.
So, Mayor de Blasio, let me ask you to talk a little bit about higher education, the other end of the life course in terms of education. Needless to say, this is a really important question that means a lot to us, to many of us in the room here at CUNY. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell us what you're thinking about this. A lot of us here at CUNY are concerned about a possible reduction in state support for people who read the New York Times, which I hope is everybody. We've learned that there's talk of moving almost $500 million a year from the state to the city budget. I imagine that's keeping your budget office interested. And I won't go through the whole litany of concerns because I know you know and many, but we're worried about cuts, of course, that would have dire consequences for our students. Chase spoke about the profile of our students, our staff, and the faculty, especially the adjuncts. You've linked support for public higher education to this concept of inequality, to efforts to reduce inequality. We need something different. You've talked about CUNY as being at the heart of economic development for the city. So what do you see for the coming weeks and the long term in terms of public investments in the City University of New York?
So first of all, I'm proud to say we have proactively invested tens of millions more each year in succession, now going into my third budget, which we project to invest even more in CUNY, beyond the basic support the city provides to the community colleges. We've invested additional money in the community colleges because we believe that there's just endless potential here to, one, prepare the people of the city, particularly young people of the city, for today's economy. And we're putting a lot of our focus on STEM programs, especially two-year STEM programs, which I think is a great ticket straight to this booming technology sector we now have in the city. But we're also investing a lot in the ASAP program, because what's happened in CUNY and many other universities around the country is that young people get there not having been given the support, not having come from an environment where the pathway through higher education was necessarily laid out to them by family members previously. And there are some real tangible supports that can be provided to help have a successful experience and graduate and thrive. So we've been proactively putting extra money into both of those. And we believe, by the way, I have a lot of respect for the people who teach here and the people who make CUNY work every day. So we've said, just like with 95% of our city workforce that we've come to new labor deals with that help the workers, fair to the taxpayers, we believe the same should be done for CUNY professors and CUNY staff. And the city already has long since committed to a share of that labor deal that we're ready to pay right now. And we look forward to the state doing their share so we can settle a long-standing issue and pay the people who work at CUNY well. You are right. You are right. We were more than surprised when the state of New York proposed hundreds of millions of dollars that would be taken away from the state's obligation to CUNY and suddenly dropped on the city of New York. And I made very clear that that was not acceptable to the city of New York, and it's not acceptable to the people of the city of New York. It's not acceptable to a lot of folks in the legislature. We have been given the governor's word very publicly that that cut will not occur. And I've said I appreciate that, and we will hold them to it. And this will all come to culmination in the state budget on April 1st. But rest assured, there are lots of people in the city who will join with me to make sure that the state does not back away from its commitments to CUNY.
I want to propose a tweet. As you may know, there was a tweet by one of those guys running for president, which was a gun, and it said, America.
Yes.
The mayor responded, I haven't seen it, but apparently responded with a pastrami
From
sandwich.
Carnegie Deli,
that's
which
right.
And said, America.
And a big one.
But we really should have a bunch of public education graduates, and that's America. Janet's father, my father. How can we not honor that great tradition in our country?
Amen.
Amen. Mayor de Blasio, you have endorsed Hillary Clinton.
Yes. Professor
Krugman, you've been outspoken in your criticism of Bernie Sanders, which has lit up the internet a good bit. It seems obvious that Bernie is the superior choice in relation.
All right.
In relation to tackling inequality, he is more outspoken and he's bolder, especially about the top. Why are you both not more enthusiastic about his candidacy?
Well, let me start this because I think we have to really appreciate, again, the moment in history. This is from the heart. And by the way, from the heartland, I just came back from Iowa a few weeks ago. And talking to activists in Iowa and talking to everyday voters, and I went and knocked on a lot of doors and talked to a lot of people, and amazingly, they said they liked them both. And this is not an idle point. People appreciated the qualities of both candidates, and if you look carefully at the platforms, you're seeing, thank God, in my view, Democrats acting like Democrats, or to borrow from Howard Dean, from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, people, both cases, talking about higher taxes on the wealthy, expanding paid family leave, paid sick leave, higher minimum wage across the board. And I thought Hillary's speech this week in Harlem about addressing the intersection of economic inequality and racial inequality was extraordinarily sharp and blunt and powerful. At the same time, we've got to appreciate what Bernie has done, because I've appreciated Bernie Sanders for decades. But I'll tell you, he has helped to energize the discussion of income inequality in this country. He has helped to push the spectrum. And a lot of people I talk to in Iowa and a lot of people I talk to here, and I feel it myself, really appreciate that this is all adding up to bigger change. So I believe, honestly, that Hillary Clinton has, in many ways, a stronger platform, and obviously Paul has spoken to the issue of why her platform addresses the excesses of Wall Street more effectively. I obviously believe her experience and her capacity would make her able to be a very, very effective president, particularly at fighting issues as entrenched and thorny as income inequality. I happen to know her very personally and believe in her abilities. But I think it is important, whichever side of this discussion you're on, to see the sum total of what's happening here. A lot of change is happening. Every one of these debates, literally, every one of these Democratic debates signifies a change in the way we are talking about the issues of this country. They're literally, you're watching history move before your eyes. So to all the Bernie Sanders supporters, I say God bless you, because I know you're doing a lot of good for this country. I believe Hillary Clinton is the one who can achieve these changes, but we are actually one big happy family in my view.
Okay. So you know that New York Times rules say that I cannot do endorsements, and therefore you not only don't know which candidate I prefer in the Democratic primary, you don't know which party I prefer in the national election.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. I think what it comes down to, and I think, by the way, whoever ends up being the candidate, you want that person to have had their feet held to the fire. If it's doing nobody a favor to avoid raising hard questions at this stage, if Democratic economists, if Democratic policy wonks don't ask Bernie Sanders hard questions about his program, you can be sure that it will be raised in the general election, and if whoever ends up in the White House, if it is one of the Democrats, is still going to have to deal with those questions thereafter. So these things need to be aired now. Where I come from is basically that having your heart in the right place is not enough. It really is, and you need first of all, you need to really think hard about the issues, not just go for what feels good. And for a long time, it's been now for about 7 years, I've been arguing that while it's easy and probably appropriate to hate the big banks, that too big to fail is not actually the essence of our problem. That it was, in fact, smaller players. Lehman was not that big a player. It was, for that matter, some of the worst offenders in terms of abuses were things like Countrywide. Small banks, small financial institutions can be just as, in some cases, more evil than the big banks. So on financial reform, you really need to think hard about where the issues are. And I think on that issue, I'm sorry to say, I think that Sanders has to some extent gone for the easy slogan, and Hillary Clinton has been closer to the bone of what really is wrong. On other issues, it's very important I think, to appreciate that we're dealing with a real country with real people, many of whom are understandably cautious about big changes. The really important thing, I think I mentioned at the beginning, that we had a pretty progressive agenda coming in 1993 on the part of the Bill Clinton's administration, of which half are critically important part crashed and burned. And part of it, there were a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of them was it was asking too much. It was asking people to completely transition to a different system of healthcare. And that just was not going to happen. Even without the insurance industry, even without the drug companies, that's just too much. Because people who have good insurance are going to say, look, I can't. You say this is going to be just as good or better, but I don't know that. I think there is a lot to be said for framing your case for change in ways that is conservative in the good sense of the word, not in the political sense, but in the sense of not requiring people to take bigger leaps into the unknown than we need to do. And that, I think, is really the distinction here between that part of the program. And let me also say, we're having a controversy about some fairly outlandish economic performance estimates that don't come from the Sanders campaign but were endorsed by it. Clear thinking, taking the facts seriously, taking analysis seriously, is in itself is a progressive value. It's something that you need to stand up for. And if you reject that, if you say we're only concerned with what serves the cause, then I think you betrayed an important part of what you're supposed to be standing for.
I might want to differ on one point.
You have plenty of time.
I rarely would differ with Paul. I have such immense respect for him. But I just want a difference in terms of how change is made. You're implicitly right. I think your point about 92, 93 is very, very powerful. That I think if you look back at the moment, study the first 6 months of the Clinton administration, because whether it was very, very radical healthcare reform or acknowledging and supporting LGBT folks in the military. I mean, a whole host of really sharp things were put into the bloodstream very quickly. I think Paul's right. Some of it, in a sense, there was a reaction in a lot of quarters of this country that, in a sense, undermined the progress that could have been achieved on some of the issues. But I would also say there's a moment when change is ripe. So almost the mirror image. Right. This is one of those moments. This is, we all didn't get to live through 1933 and the New Deal. And I'm not saying we're in that exact trajectory, because we're not. But you know what? I'm sure the people who were living through that couldn't place themselves in history. They didn't know they were there. No one had a book to tell them what this is all going to mean when it all came to fruition. I'm sure a lot of the times they wondered if all of it was going to fail. Well, we're in a different but still very powerful moment in history when the two leading Democratic candidates are battling each night on who is more progressive, who will be tougher on Wall Street, who will be tougher on the wealthy, who will speak more bluntly about racism and sexism in America. I feel like I've died and gone to heaven, okay? so that is something that we need to understand unto itself, is you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Once the discussion is reset, it does not go back. I believe that in my heart, because there's a progressive impulse in many ways to history, and you can't take away these truths once they are spoken. But second, what's happening on the ground? I had this amazing experience, Charlene and I, out in a college gymnasium in Iowa with 1,000 or so caucus goers of all different stripes philosophically. But the energy, the desire to change things right now was so sharp. And that's another genie that doesn't go back in the bottle. This debate is bringing out massive, intense participation for both Hillary and Bernie. And as we learned with Barack Obama in 2008, it feels at times contentious, but the sum total for the Obama campaign was a huge uptick in energy and activism later when it mattered in November. I predict something very similar here. This level of intensity and activism does not dissipate. It gets fed into a whole host of movements. And what those movements have to do is keep all of us to our promises.
Paul, you've written a lot about the spectacle, dare I say, going on in the Republican Party. I think it's, an unusual period there. What are the lessons for lessons for progressives in what we're hearing on the Republican side? Hearing, seeing, experiencing.
Okay, I think. Okay, let's. Yes, having a ridiculous hairstyle is really not a political liability. No, seriously, I think what we're learning, and this is to the extent, I mean, if there is what Mayor de Blasio is saying won't happen, but if there's a backsliding, if once again we have the push that, Democrats need to move back to the center again, what we're learning out is that even Republican voters don't care one bit about the classic modern conservative agenda. That there really is no one out except the handful of giant donors who thinks that cutting taxes on the rich is a great idea. That it turns out actually, I think the shock to the Republicans the last week or so has been, it turns out that nobody in the base cares about justifying the Iraq War. Their own party doesn't even believe in that stuff. It really means that the American public, even on the Republican side, wants higher wages, wants higher taxes on the well-off. There is no ideological force. Now there is, unfortunately, there is an ugly strain. There is, the original sin of America still coming back to visit us. The racism is a real thing. It's really quite amazing, actually, that South Carolina, which now looms so large on both contests, should be the state that one of only two states that had a majority slave population in 1860 and is still in many ways facing that legacy, which on the Republican side means one kind of electorate, on the Democratic side means a very different kind of electorate. But no, we're seeing, it should be enormously encouraging. We are seeing that there are, if you like, there are no supply-siders, there are no Reaganites out there in the real world. It's only party apparatchiks on the Republican side who believe in any of that, or at least are paid to claim to believe in that. And that means that the country is much more ripe for change, but it also means that the ugliness out there has not gone away. I think we're a much better country, a much less racist, much less xenophobic country than we were 30 years ago, but we ain't there yet.
We ain't there yet, but it's really interesting. I learn with every passing year to abandon convention and conventional wisdom because it doesn't function. And remember in the beginning when Donald Trump would say, he attacked John McCain for not being a war hero and all, and everyone was aghast and say, well, of course that will immediately delegitimize him and he'll leave the stage. And then suddenly, he kept growing and everything. He didn't go to the debate in Iowa, and everyone's like, well, the Iowans will be upset, but he became more popular. The conventional dynamics are changing constantly. I think it gets back to what Paul was saying. It's not the superficialities and the tactics that are really the issue. The issue is that people feel cheated. They feel, the simplistic phrase is true. The American dream that they were promised, they didn't get. And that which they grew up with was undermined, and it was undermined by people in power. And so that's a pretty straightforward equation. And they have a lot to recommend that theory when you look at the concentration of wealth and power in this country, and you look at the way the 1% dominates this country and its policies, like those hedge funders who have created such lovely tax rules only for themselves. So that builds up a different kind of frustration than we've had previously. And that gets to economics, and this is not to say that race isn't a profoundly essential issue, but it says economics is leading this discussion in a way we haven't seen in most of our eras. That is unhinging the Republican base from the Republican orthodoxy and the Republican apparatus. So if you watch the commentary lately, these anguished Republican mainstream spokespeople who are like, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, they're literally like talking like they realize it's not their party anymore necessarily. It's something different. If that something different is a lot of working people and middle-class people who are seeking economic fairness, well, as a progressive, I would welcome a lot of them to join us.
So Donald Trump said you're the worst mayor in the United States. Did that hurt your feelings?
You know, I want to join Pope Francis as
Yeah, there we go.
part of an affinity group of people who have been attacked by Donald Trump, with joining together with women, Mexican Americans, Muslim Americans. We're going to form a really big coalition. I'd certainly nominate the Pope as our leader, and I think we can handle Donald Trump.
Okay. I'm going to close us out on a much more serious note. Mayor de Blasio, you've been in office. You've both spoke about this a little bit, but I want to give you another moment or two. You've been in office during an extremely complicated time regarding race in the United States. Professor Krugman, this is a question from the audience also. You've been very outspoken about race as well, noting how important it is in American politics. What do you think of the Black Lives Matter movement? Are you hopeful that it will lead to a transformational period in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. Every one of us has traveled our own journey. And in my upbringing, I happened to, for a lot of reasons, I went to schools that were very diverse. I had friends of all backgrounds. I came from a family that, because of some of our challenges, whether it was immigration or other problems and dysfunctions that happened in our family, I got a bit of a open channel to the experience of a lot of people who had been oppressed. And that was before the most important day in my life, which was September 9th, 1991, when I first laid eyes on Chirlane McCray and fell in love instantaneously. I always say for me it was love at first sight. For her it took a whole long time, but that's okay. And then my experience as the husband of a black woman and the father of 2 black children is multiracial, but obviously perceived to the world as black, has been eye-opening on so many levels. And it comes together this way. We still have a profound race problem in this country. It is structural. It combines with structural economic unfairness and amplifies in communities of color. The Black Lives Matter movement has said that we must break down the whole culture surrounding that we have to call it for what it is. It's structural racism, and it's amplified in so many elements of American life, and until African Americans feel the absence of overt racism, we're just not there. And it is through the prism of what people feel, whether they're followed around in a store, whether they're treated equally in a job interview, but there's 1,000 other permutations. So I think this movement has called the question in a way that needed to be done. And in terms of what I've experienced, it's increasingly clear to me that the only way forward is to be blunt about it. I spoke about the conversation Chirlane and I had with our son Dante, about how he had to comport himself in any dealings with the police. And I said something that hundreds of thousands of American families acknowledge as their reality, that families of color know they have to do with their young people. And of course, it became a huge controversy, but it shouldn't be a controversy because it's true, and we have to grapple with it, and we have to change it, which is why I'm very proud right now with the NYPD, we're introducing implicit bias training to say explicitly, we are all humans, we all come with biases. We have to explicitly help our police officers to understand those biases, to weed them out. There's a very positive process as human beings getting under the skin of that and expunging it so we can all serve the public properly. This is the path we need to go on. And I do think that this movement will be remembered as one that opened that door and finally got us to say a truth that we only said partially before. We say it fully, we can address it fully.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me and a lot of people I talk to, work with, and I also have a little bit more personal experience of racial boundaries than, I won't get into too much there, but is that we went through a long period of where progressives were in kind of a cringe, a crouch on this issue. They were so afraid that it would be used against them. They'd seen so many elections that were won by appealing with dog whistles.
The Willie Horton ad.
That's right, Willie Horton. And what we're seeing now, and one of the things that Black Lives Matter is showing is that people on that side of politics, people on the right side of politics, if I may say that, I think that didn't violate Times rules, are feeling good enough about America, feel that we have as a nation made not enough but sufficient progress that we can come out of that cringe and we can confront these issues. And we are. Systemic racism is a very big thing, but it's nothing like what it once was. There was you will appreciate, as well I will, that I look at polling, and in the early 1980s, a plurality of the American public still disapproved of interracial marriages. Yep. Now think about how much progress we've made there, and what we're seeing now is that progress is not over. Despite what may be going on to some extent in that other primary, that we're not going backwards. We are going to move forward. We're going to continue to become a better country, I think, on all dimensions.
Amen.
Here.
On that note,
Very
I
good
have
note.
to bring us to a close. Thank you.
All right.
Optimistic.
Yeah, there we go.
Mayor de Blasio, I'm going to ask you in front of all these people and on the television, are you going to come back? We want you to come back for another